So hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining our panel, Queer Communities and the Stage of One, organized by Parasite in the context of the exhibition Curtain, which we co-produced with the Rock Band Art Museum in Shanghai, and which can be viewed until the end of July at our space in Hong Kong, as well as at our temporary space at the Soho House, also in Hong Kong. And it gives me a great pleasure to be moderating this talk with two artists from the show, Jacolby Satterwhite and Jason Wee, as well as with our friend and previous collaborator, Russell Storer, who's a curator and who will speak about the work of another artist in the show, another figure in the show, Leigh Bowery, who has passed away, and it's a figure that Russell has extensively researched and worked with, and has contributed to the understanding of his practice. With today's panel, we wanted to visit the work of these artists, which are some of the pillars of the exhibition, and particularly of the section that can be visited at the Soho House, and to look at the tensions and contradictions and complementarities that can be found in the struggle of staging one's own persona and identity as part of queer processes, and how that individual struggle translates into building communities as well. And, you know, in the context of our exhibition, which looks at different strategies of staging and understands curtain as something that both reveals and hides, as something that both introduces a theatrical moment and is at the same time often understood um, as um, an empowering device. Is something that hides and reveals at the control of one's master, at you know, in situations where one is the master of that, you know, system of manipulating the curtain. So in that context, trying to understand how all these many individualities can form communities. So I'm looking forward to speaking to hearing first from our guests, and looking forward to a conversation afterwards. So I would first like to invite Jacolby to speak about his work and show us a little bit about the work, and to get to know him a little bit more. So Jacolby, the virtual floor and stage is yours.
Great. Thank you very much for your introduction. So today I'm sharing the film that is in the exhibition, Healing in My House. Basically, this project was like the genesis of the new series I started in 2015 after my participation in the 2014 Whitney Biennial. I had a meeting with the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and they wanted to commission me for a 2-year project to create basically a dream project that is performative, that would bridge where I was going in the previous series, you know, to something more dynamic. And to give you a little bit of info about the previous series, Reifying Desire, which is 6 parts, and it ended in 2014 with part 6. It was a sort of world building and mythological project where I consolidated archives from various footages I produced around the metropolis, New York City and San Francisco and California, I mean, Los Angeles. And I kind of, and also my mother, who was diagnosed with schizophrenia when I was a child, was Patricia Satterwhite. Patricia Satterwhite, basically, when I was a kid, she had a feverish dream to become a major entrepreneur. And it was like a delusion of grandeur for her to make these Da Vincian schematic diagrams that were wonderful drawings, that were instructions for objects that basically kind of refer to memory, but also are futuristic and about improving the home. But I realized, you know, when I was older and doing a lot of research as a painter and as a performance artist and sculptor, that they aligned with the surrealist games from the 30s and 40s, like, and the Fluxus games from that period of time, which is something that kind of rejects painting or rejects a lot of kind of like propagandistic parts apart, whatever. So I realized I had like an inclination to trace all of her drawing, well, trace like 250 of them and construct them into three-dimensional objects and composite them into 3D animation software to create these Hieronymus Bosch or Titian or Pier della Francesca like compositions that would also allow me to composite my body into the space and generate narrative. You know, like the thing is, the project isn't sentimental about her, but she just provided a really intriguing archive for me to extrapolate on. And so when I proceeded to move the project forward, I remembered that she had over 150 acapellas of folk songs that she wrote and recorded on cassette tape in the mental hospital and at home. And the language in these songs were just so striking and interesting, and they felt like prompts for me to like build worlds and to audition people. Like the lyrics from her songs sort of pivot how I conceptually navigated the work. Like, I'm not trying to, it was sort of like a music video format, but then I'm thinking about, you know, like ultimately I'm like being a guerrilla artist carrying a green screen, a camera, and a tripod in my book bag to Fire Island, getting a hotel and casting all the queer people and intriguing people from my community to, you know, get performance footage and direct them to make movements related to some of these themes. Basically, in a way, what I do is I kind of hoard archives like performance footage in my mother's cassette tapes. And I'll do something like, basically what I did with her cassette tapes is I worked with this electronic music producer who taught me a lot about Ableton and Pro Tools. And we got together and we spent 2 years making those cassette tapes into a trip hop electronic drum and bass eclectic record, which we'll call Love Will Find a Way Home. And the whole reason why I did it is because I wanted to see how could I bring the object hood back to a sonic experience. How can I make a virtual reality album that when you look on the X, Y, Z and axis while listening to the song, you have to listen to it over and over again in order to experience, you know, the synesthesia, full synesthesia of the track. So basically, I hope I'm making sense because I'm a little frazzled and have the flu this morning, but I'm going to share with you the first project that came from that series, which is the series that came after Healing in My House, was Birds in Paradise, and it's 6 parts. The final 2 chapters are exhibiting right now at House de Kunst and the Guangzhou Biennial and Athens Biennial in September. And so this is basically the first project I did in relationship to that series. Sorry, I'm going to share this again. Optimize video clip, share again, play again.
I know there's healing in my house. Why don't you come and hang? I was free to play. I promise you I'll chase your cares away. There's freedom in my house. There is no doubt. Everyone knows there's freedom in my house. When you come into my house, there is no doubt. There's a feeling of healing in my house. It will never go away or lead you astray. There's feeling in my house that won't ever die. It's feeling in my house that won't ever die. It's healing. Da 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 da. It's healing. Everyone knows there's healing in my house. In my house, won't ever die. Everyone knows there's healing in my house. Healing in my house, won't ever die.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jacolby. And we're going to come back to you with questions later. But for now, I would like to invite Jason to speak about the work that you can see at Parasite and a bit about the context in which it was made. So thank you, Jason.
Hi, everyone. I'm speaking to you all from Harlem. I usually work between here and Singapore. If you notice on my video, you could see Great Projects. It's a artist library and residency program that I run in Singapore. And I want to talk a little bit about the kind of ongoing material that the work at Parasite is a part of. And I'm just going to share screen. So, I mean, I've been looking at work that basically thinks of Asia as a little more than territory. Basically, it's a kind of event space in which I think of it primarily also in terms of its future. The way that it's, I think event space, it's always projecting forward. And to think of it in a way that's already queer, that it doesn't have to be called queer. I don't have to attach to it any kind of additional description, that in its futurity, the way that it's in some ways discomforted, it's the way it's holding paradox and contradictions that is already queer. And it had began some years ago. I actually began thinking of ways to traverse this territory actually physically. So I had an opportunity to board an oil tanker in about 2016. So that's actually the tanker that I was on. So I was on a residency program that that allowed me to kind of almost pick any charter I like, and to depart from anywhere I like, and then to arrive at any point I like. So I'd originally picked a charter that would leave from the coast of China, and I was hoping to take a kind of northeasterly passage that will allow me to cross most of northeastern Asia, past Japan, into Alaska. But what I didn't expect was that I didn't have control of charter schedules, that they change from they change weekly, sometimes even daily. So instead, my boat left from China. It crosses the Taiwan Strait. It went down Philippines, past Vietnam, and headed to Bangladesh instead. But the purpose of the residency was really for me to think and write these kinds of missives from the boat itself. And it became a part of a project that you can find online. It was included in Sydney Contemporary 52 Artists, 52 Actions project. And you can see some of the missives that I've written. They are written in haiku style. So each stanza is a series of haikus. So I was keen to work on forms that originate here in Asia. And then against the images of these endless horizons that I would see as I was on the voyage. And it became a way to speculate about the history of Asia in a way that is both poetic, but also science fiction. It allows me to think about a future that has, the future of crime, the future of color, the future of migration, the future of cities, the future of kind of this post-climate crises. And then subsequently, as I was working on that, I had an opportunity to develop the work that is actually now adapted for view at Parasite. It was a work called Quora Fora that was premiered at the Singapore Biennial about 2 years ago. And the basic idea is to really think about what it means to gather people together. Why are we assembling in public, and how do we think of the design of that assembly in this part of the world, in Asia? So it really is also a way to think about the possibility that these assemblies, wherever they occur, they kind of manifest a different notion of Asia as they appear. So I'm going to play excerpts from that. first performance. So the idea, So the idea is that that what you previously saw as the misses became part of a larger body of writing. That then you can hear the choir sing, and it became part of the libretto that formed the spine of the work. And then as the music unfolds, an installation begins to, or flags, begins to be unfurled. So I worked with a gay choir, a queer choir in Singapore for the singers. And I will play. I'm just going to show other segments of the.
When after whipping, when often turned to face, stay silent, longer than the count, longer than the count, longer than the count. When after whipping, when often turned to face, stay silent, longer than the count, longer than the count, longer than the count. When after whipping, when often turned to face, stay silent, longer than the count, longer than the count, longer than the count. When after whipping, when often turned to face, stay silent, longer than the count, stay silent, than the count, than the count. When after whipping, when after names of the tigers in the round, the unremarked, sing their tigers in the round, the unremarked, names of the tigers in the round, the unremarked, sing their tigers in the round, the unremarked, names of the tigers in the round, the unremarked, sing their tigers in the round, the unremarked, names of the tigers in the round, the unremarked, sing their tigers in the round, the unremarked, names of the tigers in the round, the unremarked, sing their tigers in the.
So basically, this culminates in a call to an invitation to also engage the installation itself on stage. So I'll just show the final bit when they are. So I put together the costumes, the libretto, the installation itself, the lighting design, and then I worked with an architect, a solid plan, as well as the choir, the singers. And then because this also is an ongoing work, it's a perpetual rehearsal in the way that it involves, it will involve over the years about 8 different composers. And up to this point, I have a couple of composers working with me. The music you'll be listening to is by a wonderful musician in Singapore called Lee Chong. And the idea is to put together an anthology of 8 different pieces to the libretto that will then be eventually performed in a space throughout the course of a day. So the installation will repeatedly fold and unfold over an 8-hour period throughout a day. It's the full extent of the work. The plan in Hong Kong originally, when Rockman and I began discussing, was to commission a third composer, and then to have the work performed live in Hong Kong or Shanghai. But then this, of course, with COVID, it morphed into the audio installation that you can now see. As Cosmin was saying, it looks like an abandoned theater with a choir that is singing from behind it. You can also see in Hong Kong the full set of writings, which is published now through Sternberg as a volume called In Short Future Now. as basically a single long concrete poem. So the shape of the poem, actually, if you laid it all out, is kind of in the shape of a sound wave. And then at the back, there are the images that had first, that the project had first begun with, as well as part one of the composition and the libretto that Chuang composed to. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jason. And I have actually like some questions for you, new questions after your presentation, actually. But before doing that, I would like to ask Russell to walk us through his work and research on the amazing figure of Leigh Bowery. So Russell, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Hi everyone, from Singapore. So thanks so much, Cosmin, for the invitation. So as you mentioned, I did work on an exhibition of Leigh Bowery with the artist Gary Carsley in 2003, which was a really exciting opportunity to bring the work of this incredible sort of performance artist into a museum setting. It's at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney. So the work that is in Cosmin's show at Parasite is this work, which was shown at Anthony Doffé Gallery in London in 1988 over 5 days. And it was a durational performance. So for 2 hours every afternoon, Leigh would perform in front of a two-way mirror, which divided 2 spaces in the gallery, just with a chaise longue. And each day he'd wear a different costume. So he had 5 different outfits, one for each day, which were part of his ongoing repertoire of costumes that he would develop for nightclubs. And it was his first foray into the art world at the time. He met Anthony Doffé through Kerith Wynne Evans, who was a friend of his from sort of clubland. And it was part of a series of performance or sort of projects by younger artists at Anthony Doffé, which was a very established gallery at the time, to bring into his gallery. So it was really brought in, it was keen to bring in this other audiences, which the exhibition certainly did. And it just really consisted of Leigh kind of primping and preening in front of this mirror. He couldn't see the audience behind it. And yeah, just posing. So it was incredible. And I mean, there's videos on YouTube. I'm not very good at sharing videos, so but do look them up. They're really quite very compelling, very sort of slow motion, but just this pure kind of narcissism being kind of portrayed within this very high-end sort of gallery setting. In the MCA show, we had the video as well, and showed all 5 of the costumes on in a display, which sort of echoed the kind of proscenium frame of the mirror in the exhibition. So just a bit of background on Leigh, so to sort of understand, I guess, where he was coming from. So he was born in Melbourne in 1961, and in a very dull outer suburban town called Sunshine. And you know, very large, sort of effeminate kid, and in a very conservative, his parents worked with the Salvation Army, so a very conservative context. And he really received sort of post-punk culture through magazines such as The Face and ID, and desperately wanted to get out of Melbourne. So he moved to London when he was 19, and very quickly became sort of absorbed into the club scene there. So I've got some images here from Taboo, which he sort of co-launched in 1985. And it's, yeah, you can see him here with his friend Taboo and his future wife Nicola in the picture on the top left. And then on the bottom right, you can see him with Boy George. So it was really this incredible sort of community at the time. It was sort of the new romantic scene in the 80s. You know, a number of designers like Body Map, you know, filmmakers and artists like Kerith Wynne Evans, singers and performers like Boy George, or you know, filmmakers like Derek Jarman and so on, were all hanging out in these clubs. So it was a very fertile, and I think throughout sort of modern history, there's been the nightclub as this hub for this kind of cross-pollination of ideas and art forms, and generating, through different subcultures, this incredible kind of creativity. So at the time, Leigh's presence was really the main thing. I mean, he would dress up, as you can see, in these quite outlandish costumes, which were, I guess, at this point, very much an extension of this sort of new romantic style, but with a kind of manic edge. On the bottom left, I've also got an image from the Joan Rivers show on the Club Kids. So he also crossed over to New York. He did projects with Suzanne Bartsch, and sort of linked up with the Club Kids in the 90s, so a little bit later. So you can see Amanda Lepore here, and some of the other kids from that scene. So this was really the kind of starting point for him in London, and what he wanted to become a star one way or the other. And but it was really through the connections that he made in this scene that he started to really, I guess, refine and extend his presence as a performer and as an artist. So through that, he met Michael Clark, the Scottish dancer, who had his own dance company, who really drew on sort of punk music scene and aesthetic. He set a lot of his dancers to music by The Fall, sort of post-punk band. He invited Leigh to come in as a performer and to design the costumes. So you can see here sort of distinctive all over spot design, which actually was inspired by Kaposi sarcoma. So Leigh's designs were not just sort of frivolous kind of decoration, but were also really drawing on, the social sort of situation around him at the time. And of course, this was the height of Thatcherism, Clause 28, and an incredibly conservative time, very repressive for queer people in the UK. So this was really an expression of kind of queer visibility in a very powerful way. So he designed the costumes for New Puritans, for example. So you can see the bumless trousers, which sort of got taken up by Alexander McQueen a bit later on. And then in 1989, he also met Lucian Freud, who had come to see his performance at Antony Doffe and had connections through the club scene as well. So for about 5 years, he regularly posed for Lucian Freud. And I guess in the mainstream art world, this is his most visible presence. And ironically, it's as a nude figure. So Freud was sort of fascinated by Leigh. I mean, Leigh was as kind of socially outlandish as he was in terms of, just the way he sort of treat other people. He'd sort of tell these, fantastical stories. He'd lie all the time. He'd steal from other people. Like he played up. I mean, his whole MO was really to shock and provoke, not only through what he wore, but also the way he behaved, as a way of really overcoming, I mean, on a personal level, a kind of crippling shyness, but also a need to, really, I guess, expand on his own body, his own presence in the world. So as a gay person from the end of the earth, a very large person. So he really played up his physicality as well. And Freud really gave an opportunity to really focus on his own flesh. And about the time he started posing for Freud, he also realized he was diagnosed as being HIV positive. So this was something he kept from most people. But his sense of mortality was also very present through these sessions and in subsequent projects that he did. So this kind of emphasis on his own flesh really started to manifest in his costumes. So he originally started as wanting to be a fashion designer, but he realized very quickly he wasn't interested in making clothes for anyone else. He just wanted to make them for himself. And he never made any money out of it. He lived on the dole for much of his life. But he was able to create these phenomenal looks from, cheap, you can see the fabrics he used are very cheap. He'd sort of scour secondhand shops and high street shops for the materials. But you can see the way he completely transformed the body and really played up the sense of the huge stomach, his sort of tallness, his kind of disappearing limbs, expanded limbs, and his head becomes invisible. So they're really quite incredible creations, but at the same time, sort of expansions of his own form. And of course, again, it was about confronting others and highlighting his presence as much as possible. Alongside these costumes that he would make, he did performances, often in clubs. Probably his most renowned performance was one he did around 1993, 94, which was called The Birth. He performed it many times, famously at Wigstock, and in the film on Wigstock, it's actually there. And as you can see, he sort of would wear this huge sort of voluminous dress, this gigantic stomach, but then he'd sort of dance around to All You Need Is Love by the Beatles, and then he'd sort of lie back on a table and start screaming, and then this figure with this body would sort of slip out, which was Nicola. And you can see the harness that he would wear, where Nicola would be sort of strapped up upside down before she came out. So, and she was covered in fake blood and sausages and so on. So it was an incredibly visceral performance. So he became much more interested in bodily fluids. I mean, he famously squirted an enema out on stage at a club. So they were really quite radical sort of body performances as well. And he was fascinated by, the Viennese actionists and so on. So, and through Freud, he became very well versed in art history. So he was very connected to, a number of different disciplines, a number of different sort of histories and legacies, and the way he developed his performances and his costumes. So you can see the influence, of course, through fashion ever since. And Rick Owens actually recreated the Birth kind of harness in a recent collection. He was also very influential on people like Alexander McQueen, John Galliano, Comme des Garçons, and Jean-Paul Gaultier, and so on. So it's an ongoing kind of thread that runs through a number of designers' work. But I guess for Leigh, the look was only part of it. I mean, it was really about his own body and his own presence, and manifesting that in a way that could expand it and just be in the world in a much more powerful way. So yes, and you can even see it started to be quoted again. I guess probably the most mainstream representation of club culture, queer club culture, now RuPaul's Drag Race. And so you can see a number of performers have quoted him in their costumes and performances as well. But I think again, it's maybe just the look is present here, but it's, to me, it's for Leigh, it's really about something that's much more poignant, within the way he represented himself. So, but of course, I think all of these performers can have taken that on in their own way as well. So, I might just end that there.
Thank you so much, Russell. So I would like to go back to Jacolby. And I have several questions, but I think like the first one, I think that the first one would be, I mean, both in the work that you just shown, and I think in many of your pieces, there's a high degree of layering and of different, I think, like sources of inspiration and of composition that you're working with. And I think there's a very interesting, I think if one would use a metaphor to describe them, I think, one can speak about like different curtains with images that to some extent sort of like are transparent or translucent, and you can sort of like see elements of like very different layers at the same time. I don't know, that's a little bit as an impression I get as a viewer. So would you like to speak a little bit about the sort of like mixing of very different references and sources, and how do you play with that as an artist or work with that?
Well, I sort of like think of it as like a conceptual palette, or like you know, like or a mood board. I when I'm synthesizing references, that's kind of like what's rewarding to me is when they're like super incongruent, because trying to force that to make sense within the type of digital and filmmaking practice that I do have, like bringing these things together to kind of form a sense of harmony. It's sort of you know, like to when I'm mending together disparate forms, it usually reveals a sort of subconscious conceptual pursuit in my attempt to resolve. So basically, like if I'm working on a piece with a lot of like performers from Fire Island that I filmed on the green screen, doing these really schematic S&M kind of performance gestures that look really mechanical. And I also have, and I'm like subverting it into this like film where the second channel has like a lot of disaster zones and climate change images. I kind of like, as a surrealist, I sort of think about how can I find the connections between the two, and then where I go is I think about like, I mean, this is kind of how I arrived at the film Blessed Avenue, which is like, it's a 2-channel film where like you see a lot of figures that look like they're in a factory or party setting, and they're all connected by ropes and chains, and they're kind of complicit. They're kind of controlling each other, but you don't know who the master and the slave is, but they're all operating in a system very complicitly. But on the right side, on the second channel, you see these Pegasus form flying over disaster zones like Antarctica melting and California forest fires. And when I started making that piece, I was like, oh, this is kind of like a complicit aesthetics narrative where like, you know, this is the way that I kind of like move, the way that's the way I kind of will arrive to something where I'm saying like I'm making a film about the interior being very complicit and unknowing, and the exterior being pure chaos, and they both like inform each other. And I don't know if that makes sense, but the way I work is basically sort of like through chance and modulation. And then like sometimes I get really specific about my references. Like, you know, I made a film that was about you know, last year when we had last year when COVID was at a really extreme height, there was a lot of anxiety about our uncertainty as being an artist. And I was having a lot of people, I mean, there were a lot of people protesting downstairs. It was so much chaos after the George Floyd murder and like being in lockdown. So a lot of my aesthetics were about, I mean, a lot of the things that I was like pulling from were like, I made a film that was basically like these fembots that were kind of autonomous and able to kind of like avoid any kind of obstacle or virus or, you know, like anything. But I don't know, I don't even want to, I feel like I'm over talking about it, but basically the reference is just like, as a surrealist exercise, bringing things that don't belong and mending them together through like extreme labor and tactile like response in the software that I use.
Well, the other question is that you also briefly mentioned it in the initial presentation, but there's obviously a lot of like very personal references in your work, and it's something that one reads about and understands, you know, that it's at the core of it, but it's not always obvious. And I you know, if that's something that you'd like to talk about more, I think.
Oh, well, the personal stuff, I mean,
how you negotiate that. Yeah.
It's, I mean, the project was 10 years. I finished the project and now I'm doing a painting show, you know, like working with my mother's archive was like, you know, a commitment. I knew I wanted to make 2 mega large series that I would spend 10 years kind of building out, 6 chapters each. You know, like my mother, I inherited like thousands and thousands of drawings, and scores and cassette tapes and instructions to kind of like manifest her vision through my own lens. Like, I'm not really trying to make a work about what she was trying to say, but I have inherited an archive that made me like that. The reason why I am an artist is because of that archive. When I was a kid and she was trying to become an entrepreneur on the Home Shopping Network, that is how I learned how to draw, because she said in order to help her, I have to, you know, learn how to draw to help her make these drawings that show up in these films. So basically, like, I have a deep understanding of her abstract pursuit that is like second nature, but in a way, it's sort of like an heirloom that I'm using to kind of manifest contemporary ideas, like which what I spoke of before, very ambiguously, of course, but like, you know, like the lyrics from the songs, the words in the drawings, the performers on the green screen, they all come together to create sort of like a harmonious, like moving image that, you know, I never know what the result is going to be, but I just kind of like push forward with where my instincts are, you know, rely on. So.
Yeah, thank you. Jason, I wanted to ask you something. I don't know if it's something about your work, but I don't know if you're actually the best one to answer about it, because the question is related to the form that the work ended up having at Parasite, given the pandemic restrictions. So given the intense performativity about the piece and you know, being so much rooted in theater, how does it work for you to show the piece in the form that we did at Parasite, you know, as we called it earlier, as a haunted empty stage, as a haunted theater? How does it work for you to have
Yeah.
such a performative piece in that form?
I've always envisioned at some point, I mean, this is a longer term project where I think for most of it, it'll be live performances, but I've always envisaged at some point it might take a much more kind of static audio installation. The basic configuration of what I had in mind actually is realized in Parasite in a way that I've always imagined that the what's in the foreground and the background that was in the performance will actually be recreated in the installation itself. So it'll still be this kind of choral sound projected from behind the installation objects, behind the flags. And then also to have a lighting sequence timed so that the lights come on and off at certain points to the sound libretto. So I think in Parasite we had just the simplest cue, which is just that the light is cued to come on at the start of each full composition, and then to turn off at the end of the composition, and then to start again at the new composition. If we had more time, I mean, if it wasn't pandemic and the difficulties of installing over Zoom, I would probably have suggested find ways to cue the lights much closer to the way that you see in the live performance itself, where we get a little more attention on each of the flag panels, because the flags themselves comprise the libretto. You can actually read the full libretto on the flags. So I thought it was I wanted the lights to kind of highlight the sound parts as they occur. Yeah. So that's really also. I mean, that's not to say that we didn't explore with your curators how else to kind of use the flags to move the audience around. So I've sent a couple of installation suggestions that would really have forced the audience to walk around each panel a lot more. But I think there's some constraints to the space and of course the time.
Yeah, but at the end, you know, just to push the question a little bit, you know, it's also like that absence of performers and you know, that absence of the living bodies there, and that kind of like interaction that takes place, you know. I mean, it becomes a different piece, you know. So, you know, you were mentioning now that, you know, we could have played even more with synchronizing images, and I guess that would have, you know, enhanced the theatrical nature of it, but still without the bodies and without that
And I
realist
think,
interaction.
I think one reason why I had conceived of the aesthetic installation at some point is really to think of what it means to be haunted by the kind of assemblies past, you know, the assemblies that are not at the present, that are not at the moment when the visitor encounters the work. So like you said, that there's about all these absent bodies that could have been there to either sing to you or stand alongside you as you move through the installation, or to listen to it with you. And you know, if one of the things, which is why to really get at the question of the haunting, I didn't actually put in the call to assemble in the recording. So that's entirely missing. So it's as though that can't happen. That can't be. That can't happen. For all kinds of reasons that are, I think, for me, also about Hong Kong at this moment in time.
Thank you, Jason. Russell, I wanted to ask you, from the perspective of a curator, how do you stage in absence the figure, a figure like Leigh Bowery that has always staged himself and was, you know, very the very core of his work was very much about staging and mediating the kind of identity and you know, layers that that he wanted to present to the world. So how do you do that?
Yeah,
I suppose
incredible.
like doing as a curator what Lucien Freud did as a painter, but
yeah, it was very difficult. And when we did the exhibition, that was obviously the first thing we thought about, is how do you do a show about a performer whose life was, you know, he was a work of art. I mean, that was his whole, his body was the artwork. So, so we worked with a designer. So we created special spaces throughout the exhibition that sort of recreated the zones that he would perform in, such as the, you know, the Dauphin Gallery, or a nightclub kind of. So just try and recreate the environment. Then we worked with a local sculptor to cast a real body rather than using just bland mannequins. And we found a drag queen in Sydney who would model. And finding the right size was quite challenging when he was a big man, but actually the costumes are incredibly tight and very difficult to wear. I mean, even I found it hard to get them on. So we did quite a search for the right size drag queen in Sydney. But yeah, so this sort of very visceral kind of body cast was also very important in terms of bringing the costume somehow to life. And then we used a lot of video and photography just to have, you know, Leigh's image as much as possible throughout the exhibition. I mean, luckily, Fergus Greer did this incredible series of photographs of all of Leigh's costumes over a period of about 8 years, which we reproduced as very large photographs. So you had this, but yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to not make it look emptied out somehow. But we tried through the design, through the content, to activate it as much as possible. And then by having Nicola come, and also Sue Tilley, who was one of his close friends and also modeled a lot for Bowery, she also came as well. So they were very, you know, very much present physically during the opening and the programming as well.
Good. Thank you, Russell. I wonder if you guys have any questions or any comments to each other, or if anyone present would have a question.
I actually had a question for Jacolby. I was interested in the way you use this kind of digital world and then this, I guess, real world in a sense, and how you see them relating to each other. You've got almost these avatar figures, and then you have the figures in real space.
Yeah. Well, I usually film the live action scenes first, and I like sort of look at the clips over and over and over and over and write little notes about like write little notes and build things in CGI that sort of kind of relates to that space. It's sort of like an observational painting kind of thing, like an en plein air, like landscape painting, but the digital world is responding to the live action. And, you know, like for instance, in The Healing in My House, I was filming in this nightclub called Spectrum that is like a legendary nightclub in New York City in the past 10 years. Like a lot of major peers and artists kind of incubated their ideas there, sort of. It was a very chaotic underground night space that was in like a house. It was illegal. And I remember sometimes Bjork would DJ there, and like all kinds of crazy cool people would like show up randomly. And it was just, but then it got, you know, like the city shut it down, and so on the final day of the year, like it was like on December 31st, and I went there, and then I would ask the owner to let me shoot in the empty space, because I felt like I basically came of age in that space conceptually. It was very ragey, druggy, and weird, but like I felt like I interrogated like a lot of my own identity and what I want to pursue as a visual artist through the conversations I had with the amazing thinkers that were in this club. And so I kind of shot myself doing movement in the empty club. And then when I got back to my studio, I looked for a track by my mother that could relate to that image. And there was an a cappella that was called Healing in My House. And so I worked with my collaborator for music. We made this track, and the lyrics kind of helped guide what I would do in the 3D animation. And so it kind of like went back and forth between the lyrics, the footage of Spectrum, and like, you know, my surrealist pipeline through 3D animation. You know, I filmed a lot of staple nightlife people like Iman Leclerc, who's a trans Egyptian activist and nightlife fixture, as sort of the protagonist of the film, and the one who's like moving her hands in that chariot scene. Sort of like, just like you can see that in some scenes, it looks exactly like the Spectrum. And then the live action footage comes down, and it's like this sort of blend that's sort of like trompe-l'oeil, kind of like between the live action and the CGI. And blending those worlds is important to me formally. Like, you know, I'm more of an objective filmmaker than a subjective filmmaker, ironically, even though everything's super like content oriented. But in a way, I'm thinking about how to use formalism to create a visual narrative that's sort of like a Rorschach test to the viewer. But I mean, that's how I usually deal with live action footage. It's always like there's something very sentimental about the live action footage, or like there, you know, or there's, you know, like in a new film, there's footage of me dancing in Mallorca in this village, like this like weird space, and I found a way to use it to react to like the 3D animation. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's interesting when you talk about the club as a place where you formed your ideas, and it made me think, of course, of Leigh and the club scene he came out of, and how important those spaces are for queer artists as a way to come together. Realize themselves.
I mean, and you know, it's like a meta narrative, because sometimes, you know, is partly not about the club. It's, you know, could be about the personal aspects, which is like something very interior and very like psychological for me. But like, you know, there's always a public and private kind of like binary in my like process, where I can tell you about like the public solution, something the more grander and more relatable, and then I could tell you about, you know, the layer of like building and constructing ideas through a more personal space, you know? Yeah,
thanks.
Okay, well, if there's no other questions, then a huge thank you to all of you for taking the time and sharing with us today, and also for participating in the show or helping us in the case of Russell, to include Leigh Bowery's work. And we're really grateful. And for anyone who is seeing this and who hasn't seen the show, you can still do it for another week and a couple of days. So don't miss the chance, and big thank you to all of you. Bye bye.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Nice.